Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final installment of the NYU Reynolds Speaker Series 2011 to 2012. And today we're talking about public service as a path to changing the world. And I am so delighted to welcome our two esteemed guests, Aaron Williams of the Peace Corps and Michael Brown of City Year, and Gara LaMarche, who will be moderating the discussion today. My name is Kate Otto, and I was a 2006 Reynolds Scholar. I've benefited enormously from these speaker series over the past 6 years almost, because it brings so much insight to our community. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. My work, I work in the field of health and technology. I try to develop mobile technologies to help connect people in the healthcare sense. But one thing I see every day in my job is that as technology, whether we're actually using it professionally or socially, the more we use it, the more ubiquitous it becomes in our lives. Sometimes the more disconnected we actually become as people. And one reason I'm very excited to be here and hear from our speakers today is because we really can't replace that human connection and human relationships. And I think that sometimes in a world in which we are so used to using tech, it can become even more difficult to connect as human beings, especially when we might not be from the communities that we're serving. So we have some City Year Corps members. We also have some Peace Corps members here. If you're Peace Corps or City Corps, could you just raise your hand? Wow, great. Okay, great. Welcome everybody. Round of applause for the.
Great.
Thank you all for being here today. We look forward to the discussion. And without further ado, Gara, please take it.
Thank you very much, Kate. And it's very fitting that this discussion about service take place at Wagner, which is, after all, a school which has public service in its title. I haven't done a Google search of similar institutions of higher education, but it's not the norm, and it's a distinctive thing about Wagner that makes this a very good place to have this kind of discussion. So let me say a little bit more about the two people up here with me before we open up a conversation up here, and then in the last half hour we'll widen it to everybody else in the room, because there's a lot of rich experience. It's evident in this room as well as on the dais. Michael Brown is the co-founder and CEO of City Year. In the photograph that may have been left on the table out there, he is wearing what is apparently a red jacket. It's hard to tell from the photograph, but he's chosen to wear a more conventional suit and tie today. He co-founded City Year, and in 2009, City Year announced In School and On Track, a national initiative to significantly increase urban high school graduation rates. He's been for his work with City Year, named one of America's best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, Executive of the Year by Nonprofit Times for his leadership role in Service Nation and in the passage of the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act, which is one of the first bills that President Obama signed into office in 2009. I think we both had the pleasure of being in the room when the president signed the bill. And he's also received a number of other awards. He graduated Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he was the editor of the Harvard Law Review and editor of the Harvard Law Review. He was a legislative assistant to Leon Panetta, then a member of Congress, and a clerk for federal Judge Stephen Breyer, who also went on to do greater things. Michael Brown. Aaron Williams is the 18th director of the Peace Corps since August of 2009. He is the 4th director in the Peace Corps' history to have served as a Peace Corps volunteer, which he did from 1967 to 1970 in the Dominican Republic in a training program for rural school teachers in a small town there. He extended his service actually for a 3rd year. And was a professor of teaching methods at the Universidad Católica Madre y Maestra in Santiago. I just did that without any practice. Very well. He then became a director of minority recruitment and project evaluation for the Peace Corps in Chicago, which is his hometown. He has had an enormous career in government service. He was senior manager for USAID. He attained the rank of career minister in the U.S. Foreign Service. He was the USAID mission director in South Africa, working closely with Nelson Mandela in the early days of the first democratic post-apartheid government there, led by Mandela. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Board of Directors of CARE, the Pan American Development Foundation, and the National Peace Corps Association. And interestingly enough, he met his wife during his service as a volunteer in the Dominican Republic. So welcome to Director Brown. So I want to start out with both of you about your personal stories, because there's such a connection that will be evident throughout the course of the day, particularly in terms of the kind of people who've come out in the middle of the day to hear this, between the personal and the political, as it were, the personal and the societal. So, Michael, let me start with you. You got out of the Harvard Law School, and I assume you either were tempted to or had the option to go into a firm, to do things like that. You ended up pursuing a life that has been entirely devoted to the creation of institutions and opportunities for people to do service. What led you there?
I think for me, looking back on it, it was probably a number of things, including just how I was brought up and the times they were in. I was looking recently, and I found that Apollo 1 to Apollo 11 was only 2.5 years apart. But for me, between ages of 7 and 9, there was always a moonshot going on. There was always something larger than oneself happening right when I cared, and I was a Star Trek fan. There was also things happening in America, in the streets of America, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War. There was this moment that was happening that I realized was having an effect on me as I look back on it now, all of which culminated with a couple of things. One, the day I got to Harvard, the president of the university said, "I want to welcome you to Harvard and ask you to please go away." It was the opening line, and what President Derek Bach meant was consider taking a year off during your education to go get other experience and then come back to the university and utilize that, find that passion. So I did that. I ended up working for 1 year for a member of Congress named Leon Panetta. So today he's Secretary of Defense and has done things that, across the country people have heard of. At the time, he represented 200 miles of the prettiest coastline in California, and I always teased him that no one wanted to leave there to go to Washington with him to represent their interests. So he had me and folks like us from Boston, Mass. He had a bill about national service. And I looked at this bill, and maybe it was because all these things in my youth that all came together, and I thought, this is the most extraordinary idea I had ever been presented with. Having young people do a year or two of service, having them come from all backgrounds, could even help complete the civil rights movement. It could be a multi-billion-dollar service resource. It could be a spark on the rest of society. And if you tied life-changing benefits like access to college to a year or two of service, like a domestic GI Bill, you could provide access to the American dream through helping others. I was thunderstruck by this idea. And I called up my college roommate, who I left back at college, Alan Casey, and told him about this. And he said, I love that idea too. And basically, ever since then, looking back on it now, that was sort of the policy point of passion that let me sort of express all those feelings that we needed to move the country forward, and this could institutionalize a sense of idealism in America if you actually had a system of national service. And that was really, I think, the spark there. And then basically, ever since then, decided why not start a program that could help demonstrate an idea, because it's so big. Sort of, let's experiment with it. But that was, I think, the focal moment of that policy.
And that bill, the year he introduced that bill that turned you on so much was in the 80s?
It was 1982.
And so it was a while before it became
Yes.
AmeriCorps, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't realize he was in on the ground so early. So, Director Williams, you were, it's 1967. You're 10 years old, I guess, the earliest volunteer, the youngest volunteer for the Peace Corps in history.
Used to be 10. Now I'm making it 5.
How did you get from wherever you were in Chicago to the Peace Corps? What inspired you to do that?
Gary, it was a long walk from the south side of Chicago to the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic. I didn't even know where the Dominican Republic was. I knew we had invaded it. I wasn't quite sure where it was. But first of all, I was still pretty young when Kennedy was president, but I heard a couple of his speeches, and he asked young Americans to do something on behalf of their country. And as we all know now, that was an extraordinary request. And thousands of people responded to that request. And the idea of serving, of going to a different culture, learning a different language, inspired me. And I thought I'd give it a try, although no one in my family or in my circle of friends thought it was a good idea. They thought it was uniformly a bad idea. Thank God my mother, God bless her, she thought it was a good idea. And I don't know why she thought it was, because she had never really left Chicago. But she said this was a good idea. And so I needed that because it was a weighted vote. It really helped me weather the storms of everybody saying, just settle down, start teaching, have a normal life in Chicago. So I go off to, in those days we trained at universities like NYU and other great universities in this country. So I flew off for the first time. I got on an airplane, went out to San Diego, and I trained at San Diego State College. And something really marvelous happened that first week in my training camp. First of all, I get there and I'm with 100 people, strangers, and I'm thinking that first couple of nights, why did I do this? Why am I with this strange group of people? I don't know them, they don't know me. How am I going to relate to them? Where is the Dominican Republic? Why am I going there? And so, but within a week, something extraordinary happened, at least in my view. I found out that these 100 individuals were special people. They listened to each other. We wanted to improve the world, make the world a better place. We were quickly united in that cause and that quest. And I found out that many of these individuals who have turned out to be my lifelong friends, and one of them is here today with us, Judy Johnson-Bombs, who served with me in the Dominican Republic. Judy, wave your hand there. These were exceptional people, and I'm really proud that I had a chance to serve with and continue to represent these kinds of individuals. And so the Peace Corps opened up for me doors that I didn't even know existed. I didn't know what a Foreign Service officer was in 1967. I spent 22 years of my life as a Foreign Service officer. I've had a career in business and government and the nonprofit world. Without Peace Corps, I would not have had a career like that. I've had a chance to work in many, many countries. And now I have this extraordinary opportunity, thanks to President Obama, to serve. It's a privilege to serve and represent this wonderful organization where 200,000 Americans have served in 139 countries over 50 years. And now as I travel the world, I've been to 13 countries in the past 2.5 years in my service as director, and I see these remarkable Americans doing the same kinds of things that Judy and I did back in the day in the 60s, making a difference, beloved by the communities where they work, working on the priorities of the countries that invite us. It's a marvelous thing to see. It's a wonderful American success story, and I'm just proud to be part of it.
50th anniversary of the Peace Corps this year, is that right?
That's last year.
Last year, I'm sorry. And City Year will be soon celebrating its 25th anniversary. So these are two now enduring institutions with a lot of impact on the world. I wanted to ask you both, as we get into the conversation, what is, I think people have a general awareness of what the Peace Corps is and what City Year is. Certainly a number of people here have a very deep awareness of what City Year is. What's the most exciting thing, new thing in the last year or so that you're working on that you want to talk about? Mike?
Sure, and I also want to say it's particularly exciting to be with Director Williams. The Peace Corps was a huge inspiration, for your first question, for our generation in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, when we first started City Year, we branded ourselves City Year, a new urban Peace Corps.
Right.
And we put that on every bumper sticker. And then one day, I got a Xerox copy of it in the mail from the legal office of the Peace Corps that said, this is the federal government, cease and desist. And I was like, the Peace Corps has heard of us. That is so cool. And that forced us to say, well, maybe we should have our own tagline now. But that was the kinship that we felt. What we're working on now is for many years, we tried to demonstrate through City Year that young people could be, the metaphor we had could be the yeast in the bread of every nonprofit out there. So every nonprofit's having their own bread to bake, and then you add young people, and they will make it grow. But 6 years ago, we stepped back with a strategic planning process that asked one big question, is how could we have more impact with this incredible core that we have? And we realized that most of our core was working already in schools. We began to study that. We talked to academic experts on it. And what we decided to do was focus entirely on high-need schools in the country. At the same time, Johns Hopkins University had come out with research that found that 1 million students are dropping out of high school every year. It's an enormous crisis. It further found that 12% of the high schools are producing 50% of the dropouts. And then it further found that you can identify who's likely to drop out with an uncanny ability to predict as early as the 5th or 6th grade by 3 early warning indicators: high absences, poor behaviors, and getting an F in math or English. And we realized that our core could work against that metric set in a very powerful way. So what's new at City Year is this focus where we are now seeking to be a high-yield, low-cost, new human capital solution to bringing evidence-based practices against metrics that matter on the dropout crisis. and helping to turn around low-performing schools. And so now, the core members that you see here, it's so great to have you here, they know what their metrics are. It's absences, behaviors, course performance. Research that says those matter, and the question that we have is how can we get better and better at that every day?
Well, first of all, Michael, I agree. It is wonderful that we're here together today because of the synergy between our two organizations. It's just a wonderful partnership, and we're looking forward to continuing to deepen that partnership. Well, like Michael reflected on, we also, when I came to the Peace Corps and in my confirmation hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as a matter of fact, interesting thing, part of the Peace Corps network, the person who chaired my confirmation hearing was Senator Chris Dodd, who also served at the same time with me in the Dominican Republic. How about that for full circle for him? And he has been a tremendous champion of the Peace Corps. We miss him terribly in the Senate now. But in the hearing, I said that Peace Corps is going to be 50 years old. And any 50-year-old organization needs to take a careful look at its operations across the board to see how we can modernize and continue to be relevant in the 21st century. And so we conducted a comprehensive assessment of the Peace Corps over 3 or 4 months. And then we put together a team to implement the 50 recommendations that came out of this assessment. Our operations, our recruitment, our program, support for volunteers, medical services, across the board. And that's been one of our real seminal accomplishments in the first couple of years. And one of the things that came out of that assessment was we came up with a new initiative called Focus In and Train Up. Focus in on the sectors that can really make a difference in the countries where we work, whether it's health or education, teaching English as a second language, environmental programs. And then to be sure that we train our staff so they can then train volunteers in ways where they can really be effective in these countries and really create strong partnerships with our host governments and with other organizations that work in those countries. So that's been really one of the things that I'm very proud of. We've really embraced it as an organization. We had a wonderful briefing yesterday in our senior staff meeting about how far we've come and how much further we need to go. And it really shows how you can really convert an organization by looking at things across in a very comprehensive, holistic fashion.
I'm kind of sorry, Michael, that you answered the question with the metrics answer, because my next thing I was going to ask, which I will ask anyway in a different way, not being a very flexible person, is about, I think when people think about service, very often they think about the benefit to the person doing the service, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. There's obviously an enormous personal benefit to it. Both of you have talked about that, and everybody who's ever known of it in any of these organizations or the Peace Corps says that. The other part of that equation, though, is the societal impact or the social impact. So you're honing in more on that, I can see. There are critiques. I mean, everybody loves what you're doing and what the Peace Corps is, but I mean, to the extent that there are critiques, it would come from people who think, well, is this a feel-good experience, and should we be putting money into something like that? It's good, but we have urgent national concern. So it seems to me that the conversation about impact has been ratcheted up to a much higher level in the world in which we live. And how does the Peace Corps look at that? I mean, it's obviously also the other part of that equation is the role of the U.S. in the world and in the host countries. But has there been evolution over the years in the way the Peace Corps looks at not so much what's good for the person doing the service, but what happens on the ground?
First of all, I think we hear these questions a lot about what do you provide as a Peace Corps versus what an individual volunteer receives. Well, any of us who serve in the Peace Corps will tell you that we receive 5,000, 10,000 times more than what we could ever give. But I think one of the things that makes the Peace Corps service so important and where we contribute to sustainable development is that we always focus on the priorities of the country where we work. After all, we only go in when we have an invitation from a country. And secondly, we work on empowerment at the grassroots level so that people can actually take on their problems. They can identify their problems and then take on the solutions to solve those problems. I think that's the most important part about a sustainable response that Peace Corps has in terms of development. And the other thing is that we've looked for ways to develop creative partnerships. As we all know in this world, no one can do it alone. Everybody needs partners, and we all seek partners from the business community, from other government agencies, from the leading, in our case, from the leading international organizations that work around the world. And so we've tried to create partnerships that can give us the best training in environmental management, the best training in teaching English as a second language, the best training in global health and combating HIV/AIDS and malaria. And then providing opportunities for Peace Corps volunteers to work side by side with those professionals, because often in the countries where we work, in the developing countries where we work, a Peace Corps volunteer walks that last mile to impart messages of development in villages that would never be reached by government ministries or by NGOs. And so we think that's our niche, and that's how we can focus on being sustainable development at the grassroots level.
It's obviously a double-sided coin, and that's one of its great strengths, that when you serve, you're having a tremendous experience, you're being invested in, you're often out of your comfort zone, you're growing. That can affect your entire life. It can affect the entire career that you have, and the decision-making as you get infused with a sense of civic values. Someone once said that the path of service leads from charity to justice. You walk that path, eventually you grow in terms of what you think are your wider responsibilities. And whatever puts you on that path that's okay, because of that path is that life-changing. So I don't think it should be penalized for the fact that it also has that. It also has that tremendous investment in oneself. At the same time, it's getting tremendous things done. And I think we should actually compare everything else to that standard. Are you always doing at least two things at once in terms of those investment? Having said that, I think there's a new role for service that is emerging that's very exciting. I just had the opportunity to speak to the Wagner Reynolds Fellows on Social Entrepreneurship, which is such an outstanding program. And the problems in our society are so complex that they need cross-sector solutions. They need leaders that can be very nimble within the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. And then public leaders need to be able to embrace those. In fact, that may be the only way that we're going to get large-scale change. The fuel for those needs to be a human capital. And national service, international service is really the fuel to develop the kind of solutions for society that can have great legs and great promise. And I think that that's where the rubber's going to hit the road in the future, as service is increasingly used, as it's always been with the Peace Corps, and now with City here, and in many others, as a solution to problems, and one that can really point the way to higher public policy issues as well. So I think and it should never be penalized for the fact that when you first talk to someone who served, they're talking about this incredible experience about themselves first.
Yeah, but there's a societal metric there too, it seems to me. I mean, I've known a lot of people over the years who, for instance, they may not have done service in the formal sense. They went on the freedom rides. They did what they went down south in the civil rights movement. Or maybe they were in the Peace Corps, and now we're getting people, generationally who 20 years ago might have done some national service thing. Like City Year or Teach for America and so on. And the societal metric for that is that very often I found, this is anecdotal, but maybe you guys have more evidence on it, that that person not only feels personally fulfilled, but goes on to live a life of public commitment. They may or may not stay in public service in a literal sense. They might be a Wall Street lawyer, but the fact that they did that for 2 years in the 1960s or 70s has led them to do a lot of other civic things. Do you have any kind of evidence of that kind of impact?
We don't have any hard empirical evidence, but we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. And the people I met last year when I was engaged in many events regarding the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps, we have, of course, affinity groups, Friends of the Dominican Republic, Friends of Mali, Friends of Thailand, and so forth. They came out for the 50th to represent the 200,000 Americans who served in the Peace Corps. And I was struck by the fact that so many of these individuals were involved in some form of service, either as their principal career or as a sideline after they did their legal work as a law firm or after being a medical doctor somewhere. And how that spark was started by the Peace Corps. And they, of course, they're also very knowledgeable about world affairs. They also have encouraged their children and their other family members to get involved in public service. As a matter of fact, the Peace Corps has become not just an individual volunteer engagement, but also a family involvement. We see that all the time. Families visit their volunteers. They see what they're doing, then they decide to contribute at the grassroots level to the communities where the volunteers are actively working. I see a lot of nodding heads here. People have done that in their service in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So I see more and more of that, and I see networks of people who served, who are coming together to work on solutions in our country and elsewhere in the world.
And Gara, the fact that you're moderating this panel is a great opportunity for me to share what the Atlantic Philanthropies has done for our organization, which was the lead strategic investor in us that helped to build us and literally take us across the country. And at every step, the question that the Atlantic Philanthropies asked us was, what's in the way next of you your next goal? And one of them was this exact question. So the Atlantic Philanthropies gave us, I think at the time it was a $2 million grant to do a quasi-experimental investigation of our alumni. And we interviewed intensively 3,000 City Year alums on just these questions. And we found, and we compared them to people that had applied to either City Year or the Peace Corps or some other AmeriCorps program. So in other words, it wasn't like the fact that these were self-applying people to City Year. We controlled it against the propensity to serve, as they called it in the research community. And we found that the City Year alums were 3 times more likely to vote than their equally situated peers. They were much more likely to have a friend of a different background and much more likely to volunteer and to see themselves as someone that needs to join an organization and help solve a public problem than other similarly situated peers that hadn't done an intensive service experience. And frankly, we held our breath when it came out because this was always the theory of this, that this would be good for the democracy. And in fact, it was really exciting when the results panned out that in fact, through an intense year or two of service, you really imbue yourself with this sense of a larger sense of citizenship.
You know, let me just add one other thing, Gara,
Sure.
on this point. Last year also, there was a study, independent study that was launched called Answering the Call, which talked about Peace Corps volunteers and their service. And something very interesting came out of that survey. 98% of the returned volunteers who responded to the survey said that they would do the Peace Corps over again. They would recommend it to their friends and family. 98%. That's a pretty high number for any associated with any organization, right? And by the way, one of the principal movers and shakers behind the study was Senator Harris Wofford, of course, who is a man who personifies public service. All of us know Harris Wofford. He's been a tremendous friend and advisor to me in my service as Peace Corps director. He, of course, is one of the founders of the Peace Corps. And it's quite extraordinary when you look at the results of that and the fact that how it changed their lives, it transformed their lives, it led them to different careers in service. So we have some evidence of that.
Well, mentioning Harris puts me in mind of another thing I wanted to raise. Harris just turned 86, I think, last week or the week before. Talk a little bit about the multi-generational. I mean, one of the most famous Peace Corps volunteers in my memory is Lillian Carter, the mother of President Carter. And, you know, Atlantic, which a few of you have mentioned, was focused on successful aging as well as younger people. And we tend to think of service as a young person's thing, and it is largely, but it isn't only. And what about the opportunities for people at different stages of life to contribute?
Well, right now, about 15% of our volunteers serving worldwide are ages 50 plus. And I find in my travels and when I interact with these volunteers, they perform a very important function in the Peace Corps. First of all, they bring maturity and experience and form a stabilizing force within any volunteer cohort. And the younger volunteers really look forward to working with them. They enjoy working with them. They offer a different perspective at this point in time in their lives. And of course, they're welcome in the developing world where age, of course, is highly respected. And what you bring because of that age and wisdom. And so we find that they really represent a really important core part of our overall volunteer cohort. And I would guess, and I'm starting to see some evidence of that in our recruitment numbers, that as the baby boomer generation starts to retire, we're going to see more and more individuals who are interested in serving in the Peace Corps. And we certainly welcome those individuals. As a matter of fact, I was talking to a lady here today before this event who told me she's going to re-up again in the Peace Corps. So I was happy to hear that.
Any implications for your work? I know it.
Yeah, well, in terms of the work in schools, we're finding there's an organization called the Experience Corps.
Right.
Which is utilizing senior citizens, retirees, to go into schools and to help students read at grade level. And I think that intergenerational transfer, look, we know that there's a conspiracy among generations, right, between grandparents and grandkids. Now, if you can actually take that sort of wonderful sense of conspiracy that they have and utilize it to get these kids reading at grade level, that's incredibly powerful. And as Director Williams said, the cohort, the baby boomers, is gigantic right now. And I think there's a real policy implication that I hope gets played out in this election cycle as well about calling on Americans, especially as they're living longer and have more active years. And you know, they really want to make a difference. And the concept of the encore career is one that can be rooted in service.
Yeah, I was really encouraged by the fact that in 2008, both Senator Obama and Senator McCain elevated service in their campaigns, and I think it was on September 11th of that year that they appeared together at Columbia in an event. And as you invoked earlier, Senator McCain was always a very strong supporter order of service. I happened to see a picture that you circulated today of then Governor Bill Clinton visiting City Year in
91
or 91. And in the room was a very enthusiastic Mitt Romney, so that makes me slightly optimistic that maybe we could have the only ray of bipartisanship in American life about service. But to talk about that for a minute, it's important that this not be politicized and that people across the spectrum see service as important, and whether it's Peace Corps or City Year, and how does that look? Do you still have bipartisan champions, and is there more we could be doing to make sure that this is not one of those many things in American life that is contested ground?
Well, from our standpoint, we do enjoy bipartisan support in the Congress. We're also fortunate that we have 4 members of the House of Representatives who are returned Peace Corps volunteers, and they are vociferous advocates for the Peace Corps. And I choose my words carefully. Not a day goes by when I don't talk, no, a week goes by when I don't talk to one of the individuals regarding the Peace Corps. As a matter of fact, one of the members is Sam Farr, who took the seat that Leon Panetta used to have in Carmel, California. He served in Colombia. He was recently with the president at the Summit of the Americas in Colombia. You know, they're strong supporters. So I find in terms of our key committees that the chairman, and the ranking minority members are all strong supporters of the Peace Corps. And why is that? Because they recognize that in the 21st century, we need to have Americans who are going to become global citizens. And the Peace Corps provides a bridge to allow Americans to make that difference. And it really resonates with the Congress, despite the budget problems that we have in general.
You know, we've always been, service is a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue in it, but you need to maintain that intensively. We largely built City Year by having a visitors program. We just thought if we could just get folks to sit down with the young people who are serving, then they'll get it and they'll be inspired, and policy will emerge from that. And one of the first visitors we were starting City Year, was actually Greg Petersmeyer, who was the head of the first Office of National Service for George H.W. Bush. And that administration had the first investment in national service, created a commission on national and community service. And when President Clinton came along, that turned into the Corporation for National and Community Service. There was also the Points of Light Foundation that was started at the same time. If you look back on it from President Bush on, actually from President Kennedy on, of course, every president has moved service forward, from the Peace Corps to VISTA to this commission and Points of Light, through AmeriCorps, and now the Serve America Act. President George W. Bush increased AmeriCorps from 50,000 to 75,000 members. And so it's really important that concept that the President of the United States really advances service in America. And that's something that we need to work on together and make sure that there's bipartisan support for that. And that's why we were part of a coalition that did bring together then Senator Barack Obama and Senator McCain on September 11th to talk about service. It's also important that it's not a partisan issue, but it does need advocacy. That's incredibly important. And frankly, I'm really grateful, Gara, because when you were at Atlantic Philanthropies, not a lot of philanthropies actually say they will fund advocacy. They sort of shy away, even though it's legal and you can do it and it's important and it's not partisan. It's about promoting an idea. And when the Serve America Act was in jeopardy and then the funding was being cut, it was a grant from the Atlantic Philanthropies and Gara that actually allowed us to create the Save Service Coalition, which has helped to protect a lot of these fundings for the Corporation for National and Community Service. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate the leadership, because I think it's very important for those of you that are in philanthropy or go into philanthropy that it's okay and in fact important to fund nonpartisan advocacy about public policy ideas that matter.
Well, thank you. And I think that one of the things that I felt strongly about is that there is a strong link between service and advocacy, or service and policy. I think one of you used a quote that the arc wasn't the arc of bends toward justice, but it was a little bit like of service to justice.
Yeah, or path of service.
Charity to justice, something like that. And I think that's the way many people see it. I think that when you go into the field and you're working in an underserved community, whether that is inner city Chicago or Mali, you can't help but come away from that seeing larger things that your own personal capacity can't affect, right? Maybe it's more foreign aid, maybe it's different school funding formulas, whatever it might be. And so talk a little bit about, and I think that is sometimes political, but not necessarily partisan. So sometimes that agenda is about service itself. I mean, there is a challenge in the current economy and in the rather toxic political environment we have to the appropriate levels of funding for things like AmeriCorps. So that's an obvious thing. But then there are other kinds of advocacy. Can you do you think, is there some sign that Peace Corps people, for instance, take a stronger lifelong interest in foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world and become active on those issues?
I don't think there's any doubt of that. Let me just give you an example. As I travel around and I visit various countries, invariably I'll find that the U.S. ambassador in any given country, especially in the developing world, is a returned Peace Corps volunteer. Certainly his or her staff, the country team, would be the political officer, the economic officer, the consular officer, probably have served in the Peace Corps. Then if you look at the United States Agency for International Development, where I spent a large amount of my career, certainly a large percentage of aid officers are returned Peace Corps volunteers. But it goes beyond that. If you travel and look at the projects that are being carried out, development projects in any given country, the leaders of the leading international organizations, the NGOs, many of their leaders are, of course, returned Peace Corps volunteers. They're eager to hire returned Peace Corps volunteers to work in these projects. Then let's cross the street over to the host government, and you'll find the leaders of the host government, presidents, vice presidents, ministers of planning, ministers of finance, who were impacted by a Peace Corps volunteer in their youth as a mentor, a teacher, a coach, including the vice president of Ghana, who, when I went with him to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps and met with him, and then we went out together to celebrate the year of the teacher in Ghana. He told me a marvelous story about a Peace Corps volunteer who had been his teacher in high school in a small, remote part of Ghana, who led him to become interested in science. And now he's the vice president of Ghana. I see these stories all over the world, just marvelous stories about the impact the Peace Corps volunteers had in remote parts of different parts of the world, and then these individuals became leaders in their countries.
So we're now seeing a developing movement here of people who are in or have been in service trying to work on kind of larger policy issues connected to service?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, when we were starting City Year, it was the Peace Corps volunteers that we ran into everywhere that were our earliest supporters. Paul Tsongas, when he was senator, was the first person to join our board, and he said it was because of his Peace Corps experience. And now we're seeing AmeriCorps members everywhere. 700,000 young people that have done AmeriCorps, and they're going into all kinds of fields. One of the things that I had a chance to share with the Reynolds Fellows just a little bit earlier is there's a concept that I call the social entrepreneur's trap. And the social entrepreneur's trap is that you become involved in social entrepreneurship because you're passionate about a problem, and you get so involved in building your organization and now trying to double it and triple it, which is really hard, and sustain it, that you're not really working on policy. And in fact, policy seems like, oh, politics, I don't want to go do that. When in fact, you may actually be in developing the solution that policymakers can come together on, Democrat and Republican, independent alike, and say, I can support that. And so it's really important for social entrepreneurs to engage in public policy, to bring visitors to what they're seeing, and to develop a blueprint policy agenda based on what you're seeing in empirical ways on the ground in America or across the globe. That can inform policy, and it's really critical to sort of burst out of that trap. It's important that boards of directors of organizations encourage that and don't say, oh no, just stick to the knitting. Don't start getting involved in inviting politicians to come. It, of course, should never be partisan, but the engagement is absolutely critical.
I want to go back a little bit to the field and ask a question, I guess, in the general heading of cultural competency. So it's been brought up a couple of times over the course of the morning that it's it's a life-changing experience. It takes people outside their comfort zone. You had never, I take it, been on a plane or had a passport before you went to?
Never.
Yeah. So that's transformative experience.
Makes a big difference.
And so you find you didn't speak, you're fluent in Spanish now, but you didn't speak Spanish when you were.
Spanish now.
Yeah. So, and this in a similar way, in a domestic context, that's true, I think, for a lot of City Year volunteers, right? So now, the risks of something like that are that to put it most bluntly, crudely, you don't know what you're doing. you go someplace to try to affect the environment, and you don't. And so, what are the ways in which both of your organizations kind of prepare people for that kind of experience? Because it's conceivable, that you could do harm as well as good. So how do you guard against that?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something that we grapple with in the Peace Corps. I think a couple of different ways to look at it. Number one, we recruit talented people who want to serve. Then we provide them with really outstanding training, and it's three components of Peace Corps training: language training, cross-cultural training, and also technical skills. And so we can take a generalist and allow that person to be trained so that he or she can become a promoter in terms of combating HIV/AIDS, taking out messages of awareness and prevention to remote villages. We have something we created in West Africa about a year ago called Malaria Boot Camp. And so we can kick malaria out of Africa. And so we're working on trying to train volunteers across Africa in how to actually help villagers effectively use bed nets, which makes a dramatic difference in trying to combat malaria. Certainly Peace Corps volunteers are very, very skilled at doing that. Teaching English as a second language. Again, we provide great training to a journalist that can really make a difference in teaching English as a second language, which continues to be, by the way, the greatest area of demand everywhere in the world, from Mali to Cambodia to Costa Rica. Teaching English as a second language is really, really important. So we feel that we do a very good job. The other thing that I think we do today in the 21st century is that we train in country. So now, instead of training in universities in the United States or in centers here, as soon as you sign up for the Peace Corps, we send you overseas and you get 2 to 3 months of training in country. You're immediately immersed in the culture, the language. You meet your counterparts, you live with a host family. So you're really well equipped after that training to start your job and actually to make a difference on the ground. And then, of course, after 2 years, and you're really well trained, you're really adept in that culture. And that's why one of my big initiatives has been to encourage second-year volunteers to extend for a third year. So that's how we approach that. We believe that a journalist can really make a difference if they receive the proper training and, of course, are very skillful in the language. And one last thing I'll say about language training is that Peace Corps trains in 250 languages. Think about that for a minute. Many of our volunteers learn 2 languages at least to be effective in the countries where they work. So it's quite an experience, and I think we do a pretty good job of it.
I guess you're a good messenger for the message that you might consider a third year.
Exactly.
Got it yourself. Michael?
So the number one thing when we were starting City Year that we wanted to make sure we were achieving was recruiting a very diverse corps. That was always, I think, is maybe sort of the civil rights movement that we were feeling we were becoming a part of. That if the civil rights ended discrimination largely in America, largely under law, it didn't necessarily end discrimination within our hearts and our heads. You can't grow up in America as segregated as a society we are without having preconceived notion of other people, whoever they happen to be. And if national service did one thing for the country, if it just did one thing, could it just unite us, this most diverse nation, to do something together and build collective will and civic will together? So we focused on that very intensively. So the idea of having a sense of sort of humility towards other people starts with just the training of the Corps itself, because the Corps is so diverse. And even the idea of wearing uniforms, in part, was the ability to say, you know what, we're going to wear uniforms because we're going to be sort of unified in this, and we're going to really deal with us as human beings together. Corps members have told me over the years that City Year is the first place I got to be myself. I'm like, really? You're in this uniform every day? Like, yeah, but it's this fascinating thing where you don't worry about sort of what you're showing to the world, and your true self comes out. So we do a lot of diversity training, and the Corps members can speak to that. And then you have to approach all service with a sense of humility. We're going into schools, and we're guests in those schools. We have a motto that says, students first, but collaboration always. Meaning that our Corps members, they're advocates for students. They want to make sure they succeed, but they're not going to be the bull in the china shop in the school. They're going to make sure that there's a collaborative sense that we're here to help in resolving issues. So I think it's this funny combination of sort of boldness and humility that you have to keep making sure that you've got both double edge of that coin as well.
I like that. That's really a great term, boldness plus humility. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a big difference. We certainly see that in the Peace Corps. Mm-hmm.
Well, entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship certainly implies risk, and with risk comes failure. So you don't, if you don't fail periodically, you don't learn anything, and maybe you're not risking enough. And so could each of you talk a little bit in your institutions about failures and what has been learned from them, or steps taken and then corrected?
Well, I think that certainly Peace Corps volunteers, by the very nature of their work, are high-risk performers. Right? They operate under a lot of risk. When you go into a new community, a different society, and you engage with that society in what amounts to the basic problems that they confront, the challenges that they confront every day, that's a high-risk proposition. And it takes a special individual to be able to take that on. It requires a lot of courage, and especially in your first few months of your service, when you're trying to fit into that society and you're also trying to make a difference. It requires a lot of patience, something that typically the average American does not have a lot of. And so I think Peace Corps, one of the great things about Peace Corps is it does develop patience. And that becomes a very strong part of your quiver of arrows as you move forward as a professional. And you learn to read the social norms, you learn to speak effectively in the language of the country, you learn to analyze ways that things can be done so that the solutions are local and sustainable. You learn to identify leaders. Sometimes the leaders that are apparent in a society really aren't the leaders that can make a difference, the real change agents that you need to reach out and touch and empower. And so I think all of that becomes part of the stew that you engage in, that you stir, that you taste, and that you really makes a difference in how your service evolves. And I think that's how you deal with risk. And I think every day Peace Corps volunteers around the world, in the 75 countries where we serve, they're engaged in risk, in a high-risk proposition that usually results in a lot of success. It's a very interesting process to observe it. I was just in Nicaragua 2 days ago for the Close of Service conference of a group of 50 volunteers who worked in small business development and agricultural development. And we talked a lot about that, how their experience evolved from what they perceived as being a high-risk proposition to the success they had over a period of 2 years and how they reached that. A lot of great lessons learned.
The one that comes to mind that certainly has drawn a lot of humility in our organization over the years is new site expansion. So for years, the first 5 years of City Year, we didn't even consider starting a second City Year site because we were barely holding on. Just couldn't even imagine. Now we're going to do 2 of these. And then AmeriCorps legislation got passed, and there was opportunity for these grants to essentially create a marketplace for new programs, and there was some interest. So we took out a map of the United States, and we sort of picked these cities that we would go to. I forget which criteria we used. But we ended up in sort of either none of them, or 15 years later, we opened up in New York, and Itai Denor is here, and David Kaplan from City of New York, and so many City of New York members. We probably had New York as #1 kind of thing. But as soon as we sort of quickly realized, you can't just impose a program on other communities. And so we started to do that. We just stopped even talking to folks about where we wanted to go. And then this woman came to us who was a student at Harvard Law School from Columbia, South Carolina. And she saw our program, and it was before the AmeriCorps bill was passed, and she wanted us to start a program with her in Columbia, South Carolina, and we said, we're not doing it yet. So she started to work on her own. And AmeriCorps was passed, and we realized she's just doing it. Why don't we go work with her? And I called my parents, and I said, guess what? After 5 years, we're going to start our second City Year program. And guess what state it's in? And I'll give you 40 guesses. and on the 42nd guess, they guessed South Carolina after North Carolina. And I think they ran out of states after that. And so we ended up going from Boston to Columbia, South Carolina, because Mary Louise Ramsdale wouldn't take no for an answer and was going to start without us. And then we realized, okay, we get it. We will go where anyone really, really wants us, and then we'll work with them to make it happen. And there was a lot of humility in sort of redesigning that process very quickly.
Mm-hmm. It shows you how important leadership can be, and energy and passion around a certain place. Yeah. Do we have a movement for national service, would you say? I've been teaching a course in social movements to prisoners, as it happens, for Bard College the last semester or so, and I've been thinking a lot about the various social movements, prohibition, abolition, civil rights, and so on, and the contemporary movements. Would you say we're there yet with respect to service in terms of having a constituency that sees this as a kind of a core element of a democratic society and is prepared to or do we have a ways to go?
So I call this the elusive dream of national service. Every now and then, every few months, David Brooks, David Gergen, somebody will put out this really big idea. Both of them are great and they're on my board. These sort of statesmen, Tom Brokaw in his new book, they put out this idea of national service. Jim Lehrer, they're all these states folks, and they call on, we should call on every American. And I found that this idea was the one idea when we were starting City Year that Ted Kennedy and Bill Buckley, the famous conservative columnist who passed away a few years ago, they agreed on.
Orrin Hatch, who was...
And Orrin Hatch, and we did it with Ted Kennedy. So, and when you talk to most Americans for just a minute, if you did sort of a deliberative poll, and you sort of explain it, they get excited about it, because I think the idea of national service speaks to us at some core level of what we think America is all about, whether we're Democrat, Republican, or don't identify at all with any of those things. But the idea, I think, is still too diffuse. It's not a voting issue, even though there's over 300,000 Peace Corps alums now, and significant numbers of AmeriCorps alums. I do think it's going to take a generational push. Ironically, one of the things that might do it is now this era of limited government. Because as we're looking at the squeeze on budgets, I don't think you can both cut government completely and at the same time say, we're not going to replace that to some degree with citizen energy in some way that's more than just volunteerism, which is good as well. But you need to actually focus it into mechanisms that are accountable. So I actually think that that may be something that actually could find even bipartisan support, that we actually, service isn't a substitute for when you need professionals. It can't be. But it could be a way of really tapping into a lot of human capital to solve some very serious issues in the country. And if the answer is just we're going to cut the budgets and cut everything, I think very quickly our society would say, that's not the direction we can go in. That's not sustainable. We're going to have to come up with some solutions. And that could potentially push it forward. But I do also think it takes presidential leadership. This is the issue that most need a president on to say, and it's just like John Kennedy with his stirring call in the Michigan speech steps, right, that said, would you go to Africa? And I'm hoping that every president will continue to move it forward.
I would just add a couple of things. First of all, personally, I think national service would be a wonderful thing across the board. Civilian or military, I think would make a difference in our society. I have done a lot of work in Finland over many, many years, and I see the importance of national service in a country like that and in the other Nordic countries. So I would certainly subscribe to that. I see what the impact that Peace Corps has had on our nation. And I think we need to do more. Certainly we agree to everything that Michael said. I think it's going to require leadership. It's going to require bipartisan leadership. I think right now you see this great nexus between the private sector, the philanthropic sector, the independent sector, and government, where we all agree on that. I think it's a matter now to come up with the big idea and a bipartisan push to move it forward. I think it would be of great importance to our nation in the 21st century.
So we're going to go to a larger circle of questions in a minute. But the last thing I want to ask you is more aimed at young people and who might be thinking about service, whether it's City Year or the Peace Corps or something else, and what kind of advice you might have for them, particularly with the, I don't know, how hyper-competitive the world has become. There may be people who are thinking, I don't know, this would take me off the track. I might not be able to achieve my ultimate goals if I go to, Bolivia for a year or for 2 years or whatever, or if I go to South Carolina or someplace like that. And what would you say to somebody who's thinking that through, either your own children or somebody who's kind of at the beginning of their post-high school career?
Well, it's a pretty easy answer for me in terms of the Peace Corps. The people who tend to be interested in the Peace Corps are people who have some understanding and interest in the world. And in this interconnected globe that we have in the 21st century, they see that an experience in the Peace Corps can help them become global citizens and give them the opportunity to develop leadership skills that can make a difference both in terms of their service and also later on in their careers. And so we have a very convincing way to talk about the Peace Corps that leads people to join who believe in those principles and what they can do for them in terms of their long-term development. The other thing I'll say is that in terms of the demand for Peace Corps volunteers, every month I receive an ambassador from a country or one of our U.S. ambassadors serves somewhere in the developing world, and they ask me one of three questions. They'll say, can you expand the current Peace Corps program in your country? Can you come to our country for the first time? Or can you return to our country after you've been out for a few years? The demand is unlimited. We could probably, no matter what our size of budget, we probably couldn't fulfill the demand of countries in the world for Peace Corps volunteers. And they understand the impact that Peace Corps volunteers have on the young people in their countries as mentors, as coaches, as teachers. And I think we're at a very good place now. I think even though many, many countries have outstanding volunteer corps, the Japanese, the British, the Nordic countries, if you look at the United States Peace Corps, we're still the gold standard for international service. We have the opportunity to spend 2 years learning the language, the culture, making a difference at the grassroots level, which is a unique opportunity. And if you really believe in becoming a global citizen, if you want to make a difference in this world, and then bring back that rich, diverse experience and make a difference in our society, the Peace Corps is a wonderful way to do that.
So, I mean, the good news, and this gets to your movement question too, is this groundswell of generational support for service. The recent numbers that came out of the Corporation for National and Community Service, they recently announced that there were over 560,000 applications to AmeriCorps last year alone. And a very similar number the year before, up from around 250,000 just about 3 years ago. So this generation really wants to serve. There's only about 82,000 AmeriCorps spots. So you can do the numbers there. There's this overwhelming surge of folks that want to serve. And I think the economy has something to do with that, but I really think it's generational because many young people have been serving now since kindergarten, and I think it's really part of this generation, millennial generations. All the studies have shown are about service and social entrepreneurship and giving to others. But Gary, you did put your finger on it. The one thing that sort of stops people at the water's edge of whether they're actually going to join is the sense that they're taking themselves off the path and sort of going to their parents and their grandparents and saying, I'm not going to do the college thing right now or the grad school thing, or I'm going to go do this. And what I would say to that is, first of all, talk to one of these young people that have done it. And I think you find very, very quickly that it's not even a gap year, it's a leap year. It really is. It's a leap year. It's unbelievable what you get out of a year in the Peace Corps, 2 years of service. And time and again, all you have to do is talk to a Peace Corps alum or an AmeriCorps alum, and they will tell you all the things that they got out of it. And increasingly, we have a program called the Give a Year program, where colleges and universities, they so want our alums on campus that they're giving half off tuition to folks that apply. It's really remarkable. They want these leaders on their campuses. So there's just so many things that you're going to get out of this experience personally, and then you're going to be in demand afterwards. But for that one moment where you're sort of blinking and saying, all my friends are either going to college or grad school now, and I'm kind of getting off the path, that's the time I would say, go ahead, the water's fine. You're going to be great, and that it will absolutely be a huge leap year for you.
Well, you're an enormously engaged and attentive audiences. I'm comparing that with my Wagner class, but even by that standard, you're very engaged. And now we're going to go out and kind of open up the conversation. So what are there going to be? Floating mics, are there? Okay. So the drill is to raise your hand. I'll try to be as fair as I can be in calling on people. I don't know if there's anybody here, so you could identify yourself if you care to. We'll start with you, sir. Okay.
That was terrific, and thank you for allowing us to hear all of you. Mr. Williams, wanted to ask you a question, even though I'm David Kaplan from City here. What is the population now of the Peace Corps, and what was the largest it's ever been?
Right now, we have 9,000 volunteers serving in 75 countries around the world. The largest was when I served in the Peace Corps, it was about 15,000. That was a high watermark. However, we now are at the highest point we've been in 40 years. So we're in a very good place. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we have great demand for Peace Corps volunteers. So we're in more countries, but we have fewer volunteers than we had back in the early 60s.
Gentleman back there.
Hello. Sorry. My name's Oscar. I'm currently serving in my third AmeriCorps term, my second as an AmeriCorps Vista. So totally the path, definitely off the trajectory, but I feel really good about where I'm at. My question is, has there been thought to how you're going to expand and make Peace Corps and AmeriCorps programs like City Year more readily acceptable to those who maybe don't fit within the criteria right now? So for instance, with the Peace Corps, generally you need a bachelor's degree, have gone to college for a number of years, or in some instances, some countries, you need a master's degree. So I'm interested to know, I know a lot of folks who are eager to serve, but maybe have had struggles with high school or with college, and so they haven't completed, but they really want to go down a different path or experience that. And so I'm wondering, have you thought about expanding your program, the parameters or the requirements in any way?
Well, from the standpoint of the Peace Corps, it's really important to have the first degree, because we're guests in the countries where we serve. They expect to have volunteers in general, especially younger volunteers who have the college preparation. Now, as you get older, let's say 50 plus in age, now that's a different matter. If you're an experienced farmer, a carpenter, an engineer, then you can easily adapt to a job in a developing country. But I think for the younger person, the college degree is really important. 95% of our volunteers have that. So I think that's going to continue to be important because the countries want to see that level of credential.
One of the great things about the AmeriCorps framework is that it's a grants program that funds nonprofits. So there's over 500 AmeriCorps programs. And so you can really have a lot of different variation, Oscar, with those different programs. So like Youth Build focuses almost entirely on helping students get their GED. It's half service, half education. It's doing an outstanding job, and Dorothy Stroman's trying to take that to 50,000 members, which we have to get done. There's just so many. There's Public Allies, City Year's one, Teach for America. We don't require a college degree, but around 2/3 of our core now is college graduates. So I think it's really important that there be lots of models out there. And I would agree that at a point of international work, that there's going to have to be some level of education for folks who are overseas. But certainly here in the United States, there's a lot of creative programming happening with AmeriCorps for all different backgrounds.
How about over this side of the room? Any?
Oh, me? Oh.
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
Sorry, I couldn't see.
My name is Erica, and I'm a recently returned Peace Corps volunteer, served in Kazakhstan. My question is about the longevity of these programs in the areas where they're serving. So in terms of defining success, are you envisioning Peace Corps and City Year being in these areas for a short period of time so that these countries or these cities don't need you anymore? Or is it that you want to sort of maintain the presence there so it can be sort of a standing, presence in these particular communities?
Great question.
Great question. What did you do in Kazakhstan, by the way?
I taught English
Taught English,
and did
okay.
community development work.
I think from the Peace Corps perspective, you have to think about our three goals. We've had these same three goals for 50 years, which is a great privilege when you think about it. Few organizations have maintained the same goals for 50 years. And what are they? To provide trained men and women to work on priorities in developing countries, to provide the people of those countries a true look, a view of America as it really is. Not from a DVD or magazine, but a real American working side by side in those countries. And then third, to bring back this rich experience and make a difference in our own society. Those goals remain really important in the 21st century. And so I see us continuing to have Peace Corps programs in countries where they are willing to invite us to serve. Even those who might be middle-income countries, I think it's still relevant. And so I see us continuing on for another 50 years in countries around the world, because even in some of the BRIC countries, there are pockets of poverty where we might be able to make a difference.
The RIC, you mean like BRIC countries?
Brazil,
Yeah,
Russia,
India,
China.
Some pockets of poverty in those places, yes, for a while to come, I'm afraid. Yeah.
The work that we've taken on is in public education, where many, ourselves included, believe that that's where we have to take on poverty itself. That's the place we have to make our stand in a society where you want social mobility. You need to be able to have a game-changing place where people of all backgrounds, especially lower-income Americans, can come and get the education they need and to succeed. And students come in, all the studies have shown, students come in to high-poverty schools behind those of their peers around the country. And in general, schools were never designed, by the way we designed the American schoolhouse, to have more than, say, 10% of students have extra needs. But high poverty schools, 80 or 90% of the students need extra supports. And we're really not providing that as a society. And the only inexpensive, high-yield way to do it, and I think uniquely powerful, is to tap the energy and idealism of young people. And so what we're finding is that a teacher may stand in front of 30 students a day. If on any given day, 5 or 6 students are absent, a different set of students are absent every single day. She's teaching literally to a different class every single day. And the question is, should she teach to the class that was here yesterday, the class that's here today? How do you differentiate that instruction? What we're finding is if you can bring national service young people in the cohort required, the scale, we're bringing as many as 15 or 20 core members into a school at a time, and can identify the students that are off track using their data and give focus lists to these students, you can actually have a very profound impact on allowing the teacher to differentiate the instruction and to bring extra resources to the students who need it. We want to do that as long as students are coming into high poverty schools. That isn't saying that schools can't succeed. It is saying that schools need those extra resources, and we've been literally under-resourcing them because we haven't been able to provide the kind of small group one-on-one instruction and extend the learning day. One of the things that we're involved in is really education reform itself, and there's a lot of rancor in education reform in America. You can just read the paper and you realize right away there's a lot of issues there. But if you come right below that rancor, you see everybody's agreeing on largely the same reforms. People are agreeing that you want to extend the learning day. It's too short, especially in high poverty schools. You want to differentiate instruction so that students can get the instruction they need into small group and one-on-one. You want to use data rigorously, not just at the end of a term or at the end of a year, but to know what students need, what resources at what time. You want to have a strong resourcing of the human capital in the building, and you want a college-going can-do culture in these buildings. And what we're seeing is that national service, not just City Year, but many organizations that are now starting to do this, can bring in the human capital into these buildings that can solve these problems in a way that can sort of cut through kind of the question that the rancors about is sort of who controls it and how it's going to be paid for. But everyone's sort of agreeing on these kinds of things. And so in told students don't need these extra supports, that's going to be, it's a long answer to your question, but that's our commitment.
Thank you for your time. My name is Ross Joy. I'm 23 years old. Last year, and for the past 2 years, I've served as city. Last year, I worked at a public school in the South Bronx. My question has to relate with Mr. Williams. You've mentioned several times the huge market demand globally. There's the market access that is happening is very huge, and social spending in the developing countries is booming right now, as domestically we're cutting back. But I think also at the same time, we have these global issues of inequality and youth unemployment. And how does social entrepreneurship and service relate to these challenges?
Well, I think certainly in the international realm, one of the things that I find interesting about Peace Corps service is that no matter what a volunteer's primary project might be, education or in the environment or teaching English as a second language, almost 100% of our volunteers as a primary or secondary project work with young people. Because if you look at the demographics of the average developing country, of course, the largest cohort are people under the age of 27, 20, 25. And so we are directly engaged with them. The thing we also find is that they are great social entrepreneurs, but they need assistance in organizing those ideas and reaching out to support structures and organizations that can help them make a difference. In many cases, finding financing. And Peace Corps volunteers play a very good role as a catalyst in bringing social entrepreneurs to the forefront in their societies where they work. So I think, number one, that youth development will continue to be a really important sector for the Peace Corps broadly, whether it's a primary or a secondary function of our volunteers in terms of their jobs. And secondly, that the whole growth of social entrepreneurs in the developing world is something that we need to be engaged in. It's really important. And we see this in the Arab Spring. We see it around the world, in every country, in every region. So it's important to us.
Thank you for your service. I'll just say here domestically, when you invest in education, you're investing in the future workforce. Because we hear a lot of CEOs say, I have the jobs, but we don't have the technical skills yet. And so you're helping to, your service is helping to bridge that gap. In addition, there's many other AmeriCorps models, I think, that are helping to infuse neighborhoods with new life, building community gardens, which brings people out, building playgrounds like Kaboom that create a sense of civic continuity and civic capital in a community. And all of these things they're necessary but not completely sufficient for economic development, but they're absolutely critical precursors for moving low-income communities forward.
Hi, my name is Mitch Bloom. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer. I served in Togo in West Africa from 2008 to 2010. I'm interning with a group right now called Food Fight that has been intervening in schools and to revolutionize the way that teachers and staff and students think about food and its impact on their lives. And they're at this really critical stage of their growth. So I think this question is mostly for you, Mr. Brown, is how do you get large-scale support? What are the opportunities to get large-scale support, to get a glimpse, really, of the magic that your organization does to really stimulate that interest in saying, wow, we need that, we're gonna help you make it happen?
So the concept that we used at City Year over the years is the concept we call an action tank approach. And we think of it as a combination of a think tank, where you're working on public policy ideas and literally writing about them and working on the theory, and a program together. So an action tank is working on ideas and programmatically seeking to improve those ideas and demonstrate them at the same time. And it's always working against some large-scale system change. So for us, our large-scale goal was always the vision that one day the most commonly asked question of a young person would be, where will you do your year of service? That was always our action tank goal. And then an action tank question that you always want to be asking yourself is, what's in the way of getting forward on that today? What's in the way of moving it forward? So for us, it was demonstrating that young people of all backgrounds would want to serve, or that people would support it, or they could do meaningful work. And as I mentioned earlier, what we'd constantly do is bring people to visit and have a public policy ready to go. So by the time Bill Clinton came to visit, we had a public policy agenda ready to go, and saying, and we were talking to everybody, not just Bill Clinton, but anybody, and we still do, and to say, this is how you could expand service in America. You could create the equivalent of the public broadcasting company we looked at, say, for now you could have a public service organization, quasi-public, with a board that's a volunteer board, these kinds of ideas. So I really would say that the number one thing is to get people to visit, and once you have them, talk about ways that you could expand what you're doing, not just for your own organization, but for the larger idea you're working on, and how could that be turned into meaningful legislation? That's the language that public policy leaders deal with. How does this affect my world in terms of legislation? And really then pushing for that. Anything that's truly scaled in America, for the most part, is probably, if you scratch the surface of it a little bit, you'll probably find that government has played a role in it. It doesn't mean it has to be completely governmental funded, but that, in fact, government has played a role in it for scale. And for something that has a large public policy agenda like you're talking about, it's important to bring governmental actors into it.
You had a question, but you have a mic? Great.
Good afternoon. My name is Claire Thomas. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Tanzania. I served 2009 to 2011. He's smiling because we actually met in Tanzania last year.
Good to see you, Claire.
So I know both of you spoke to the importance of addressing the needs that the community asks for. And I know in Tanzania, the government was asking for secondary school teachers to teach English. And what we actually found was, although those were needed in secondary schools, they're really critical in primary schools. But because the government hadn't asked for that, there was sort of a challenge there. And so I'm wondering if you could both speak to what your organizations do when the things that are asked for are not necessarily the things that are needed in the country.
Good question, Claire. And thank you for your service, and good to see you again. One of our superstar volunteers. I'm glad to see she's here now. I think that it's really pretty easy for us to do that. There's so many needs in many countries, like, for example, in Tanzania. And we have a wonderful partnership with the government there. The president himself of Tanzania, reflected very positively on his great experience with a Peace Corps volunteer when he was a young student. I think the fact that we are in the education sector allows us to talk to the leaders in the education field about other needs where we might play a role. Of course, you have to balance that with the budget, the number of volunteers that we can actually provide to Tanzania at any given time, And they actually determined what the priorities were. You know, they're the ones that decided that secondary education was so important, because just to give you a little bit of history, that Claire knows so well, that the government engaged in a school construction program, which was very aggressive, and they built a lot of schools. But of course, they couldn't keep up in terms of turning out the number of teachers to teach in those schools. And so we found ourselves in the Peace Corps providing teachers of English and also math and science in the schools that really needed it, so students would have the ability to take the courses they needed to move forward in their education. So we were providing a very important service, and there's no doubt that we could probably do more at the elementary school level. And so we're going to engage in conversations with them about that.
So in addition, we talked about humility, right? But at the same time, you can't be all things to all people. And you have to decide, well, this is what we do. And this is what we're trying to get better and better at. And as I mentioned, when we started City Year, we were sort of the yeast and the bread. So we said, how could you utilize 10 young people for a day, a week, a year with the ideas that you're working on? And I think that was important for how we started. But as I mentioned, in the last 5-6 years, as we focused in our work in high poverty schools, we can say to schools, this is what we can provide. It's evidence-based. We're getting better and better at it. We're getting investments in our training. And we'd like to participate with you. But if there's something that, other than that, we can't be good at it, we can't sustain it, and there's probably other AmeriCorps or other kinds of resources for you that we can connect with. And so it's really important that once you sort of know what you want to be good at, that you say, that's what we can do, and you try to work with partners that understand you and bring you in to do those things.
Where's the mic? Kind of like a Where's Waldo kind of thing. Nobody is on tap, on deck? Yes.
I'll go again if no one wants to speak up.
You were so good the last time.
My question is about diversity, and I know, Mr. Brown, you talked about diversity within City Year. So I was an African-American volunteer that served in Kazakhstan, and I was the only African-American in my class. It was a very unique but rewarding experience, but also for our LGBT volunteers and Latino volunteers. What is Peace Corps sort of doing to increase those numbers? Because it was an amazing experience to be the only one within the country who knew nothing about African Americans, but also it would be great to not be the only spokesperson for Black people in America. And also, but for all types of diversity, you know, what sort of things could Peace Corps be doing to increase that so people can get a good representation of what America actually is?
Right, because in the Peace Corps sense, it's also an important representational, almost ambassadorial component. Yeah.
Well, it's absolutely essential that Peace Corps reflect the diversity of America, and it's one of my primary objectives. So what are we doing about that? Well, first of all, we're reaching out to institutions that service minority communities. I speak at a lot of historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, reach out to the Asian American community. And it's something that's very important to us. But I also want to reflect on the fact that it's also a challenge. I was also one of the few African Americans in my group when I served back in the 60s and the 70s. And many minority members of the minority community face the same challenges I faced. My family thought this was a big mistake. Why would you give up 2 years of your life and you ought to settle down and get a job? After all, I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. And they thought this was a big sacrifice for me to leave and go off to some other country. It's the same thing now. Many minority students are the first in their families to graduate from college. Their families expect them to contribute to sustaining the family. Also, we have to compete. There are now highly talented minority students are being sought out by graduate schools. They want to study medicine. They want to study law. The private sector, the military is doing a tremendous job of diversity recruiting. So we have to really compete. It's a tougher job for us now than it's ever been before. And so we're not going to give up. We're determined to do it. But it is a challenge, and it's something that we need to focus on as much as we possibly can.
Question in the front row.
Good afternoon. I'm Jan O'Sullivan. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Togo 2009 to 2011 with my friend Mitch Bloom over there. I guess my question is, one of the things that was remarkable about my service was that as a mid-career professional, I had been involved with Rotary International before I served in the Peace Corps. Most of the funding for a lot of the projects that I did as a volunteer was a result of that partnership between Rotary and the Peace Corps. Peace Corps has volunteers that are in rural places. A lot of Rotary clubs in developing countries are in national and regional capitals. So it kind of struck me for the 27 months that I was in Togo, geez, you know, how better can we bring these two organizations that are, by and large, trying to achieve a lot of the same goals together. And I was just wondering, kind of at the organizational level, what kind of steps would Peace Corps be taking to partner with Rotary and or other organizations? And then I know you've got a lot of partners as well, if you can speak to that.
Well, what a great question. You know, it's interesting that you asked me this question because about 2 months ago I was out in Denver, which I find is a hotbed of Rotary International. And I talked to a number of leaders out there about a partnership with Peace Corps. And so actually we're in the process of talking to Rotary about doing more with them because everything that you say is true. Rotary is a great organization, works in development around the world, and is a natural partner for the Peace Corps. So we're actively engaged in talking to the people in Colorado about a possible partnership, and we're going to also extend that conversation to the national level. Let me just say one other thing also about minority recruitment. And one thing I wanted to mention is that we've also reached out and formed a lot of domestic partnerships with organizations that are strong and leaders in the minority community. And we think that's going to also help us make a difference in terms of recruitment. You know, but I can't ignore the fact of the challenges that we face because we have to be competitive.
I think one of the things that I'm seeing, certainly in our own work on the dropout crisis, is the idea of collective action, which I think has got a lot of legs to it, with the idea that multiple organizations can work in concert with each other on big problems. And the key is if everyone can agree to work on the same metrics. And what we're working against are these absences, behaviors, and course performance, the Johns Hopkins research that I shared with you. We're just one organization that's working with that. America's Promise is promoting these. So many organizations that are in the education space right now are adopting absences, behaviors, and course performance as shared metrics, which means that everybody can play. The Boys and Girls Clubs, all other kinds of AmeriCorps programs, the Experience Corps, and you can play at different levels of education. And I'm sure there is similar research across almost any area of concern. So rather than everyone sort of being in their own silo, if everyone's working against the same metrics, and if the metrics matter because they've been supported by research, we can actually find a new way to put together all of these tremendous organizations that otherwise you don't have to create new institutional frameworks. They can just do it because they're doing that. What we've created is a collaboration between City Year, communities and schools, and talent development of Johns Hopkins University called Diplomas Now. And our three organizations bring different things into high poverty schools. And what works is every single day we're looking at the same metrics.
Time maybe for one more question from the audience before I get a final roundup here. Who wants that privilege?
Good afternoon. My name's Erin. My name's Erin Seiler, and I'm actually a returned Peace Corps volunteer and currently working at the Peace Corps office here. It's wonderful to hear from both of you. My question is for you, Mr. Brown, since I know less about your organization and have been very interested in hearing about it today. If you could give me a snapshot of where City Year is now nationally, I guess how many cities and schools, and then and tell me what your vision is of City Year in perhaps 5 years or maybe 10, and your plans to see it, whether it's expanding or how not. So
I appreciate that. So today we're in 23 cities in the U.S. We have just over 2,000 City Year Corps members, like these wonderful young people you see here in the red jackets. We're serving in just over 200 schools. We did an analysis across the country of all of those cities, and we found that if you can get to 25% of the schools in almost any city in America, you can reach a majority, over 50% of the students who are off track. So we ran those numbers, and we found that if we can get to 6,000 Corps members in the footprint we're in, we can reach a majority of all the students who are off track in grades 3 through 9, elementary, middle, and high school. We serve in all three spaces. We concentrate in the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th grade because those are really key grades for progression. You have to learn to read, so you can read to learn by the 3rd grade. By the 6th grade, it's your first year of middle school, and you have to be able to navigate a complex system on adolescence. And then the first year of high school is when most kids actually drop out. And so what we announced this with Arnie Duncan 2 years ago. It's called In School and On Track. And it's our goal is to reach that majority level. And in 3 weeks, we're announcing our long-term impact goal. That's just a scale goal, is to make sure that at least 80% of the students that in schools that we serve in are back on track through our service in all the schools that we're in, and that we scale up to reach 2/3 of all of the students that represent the urban high school graduation challenge, the dropout crisis. That will require getting to 14 to 18 new cities across the country. Ultimately means a core of around 12,000 core members serving in around 1,000 schools across the country. And that's we're going to announce that, publicly soon. I just announced it.
I think you did.
It's all good to announce.
Embargoed for release.
Yeah, and that's going to be about a 10-year goal to get to. Thanks for asking.
I think every question here, almost every question has been asked by a returning Peace Corps volunteer or a City Year veteran, as a general effect of making me feel like a giant slacker, never having done either of those things. So I thank you all for your questions and for your service. I don't thank you for anticipating my last question about the vision for the future. So what I'm going to do instead is ask each of you if you have any concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Gara, for being our moderator, and this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I'm so glad to be here with Michael. It's the first time we've been together on the podium. I think a couple of things about Peace Corps. First of all, because we have these marvelous 3 goals, we can continue to do very important work into the 21st century. Secondly, we have tremendous demand from all the regions of the world, and we're going to continue to send volunteers there. The other thing about Peace Corps, which is marvelous, I think, is that we are very resilient and also can move very quickly because we are a fairly small agency. So when there's an Arab Spring, and we have a country like Tunisia where they decide that we want Peace Corps to return, it was one of our countries in the early 60s, we can turn on a dime and move quickly and find the priority places to put Peace Corps volunteers. That's a wonderful thing to do. We also have a marvelous office called Peace Corps Response, where we can tap Peace Corps volunteers who've served before, we have the language skills and understanding of particular countries. They can go and serve from 6 months to a year, serving again. We also have opened that up to people who did not serve in the Peace Corps but have special skill sets that can make a difference in countries around the world. The other thing is that when our volunteers return home, they make a big contribution to our society. They make a difference in every walk of life in America, and I think it's really important to continue to build that so that this 200,000 continues to grow and becomes bigger numbers in all walks of our society. And I think lastly, if you look at our growth, despite the challenges that we face in the federal government in terms of our budget, we have moved into 5 new countries in the last 2 years. We moved into Sierra Leone, Indonesia, Tunisia, Nepal. It's really been quite extraordinary, Colombia. And I think if you look at why we're there in the 21st century, you see that Peace Corps can make a difference in the lives of the people in the grassroots communities in these countries, and the leadership in the countries recognize, and the people in those communities recognize. So it's a marvelous track record, and we're going to be strong and resilient and continue to grow into the future in 2020.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gara, and for your leadership, especially with the advocacy behind our field, which has made a tremendous difference in today's moderation. Director Williams, we have this wonderful partnership. We did our first Leadership After City Year partnership between City Year and the Peace Corps, where we are promoting the Peace Corps as an opportunity for our alums. And we're very proud every time a City Year Corps member writes and says, I just got into the Peace Corps, and is going on with their service and taking it internationally. And so we're very excited about that. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I guess I would just share that being on a college campus is always tremendously exciting. And I would say so many people in the room have already done so much. Many of you have already served or are serving. I would say that you're needed. You're absolutely needed to keep doing what you're doing and to use this tremendous experience of this profound education investment in you to help improve the world. That, as I said earlier to the Reynolds Fellows, there's this saying that always motivated us that said that when you commit to something, then providence moves too. The world conspires to help you once you commit. So for those of you that are thinking about, okay, I'm going to either join the Peace Corps or City Year or go on from one of these experiences that you're having now in your education to start something or join something, it'll feel a little bit at times like you're running away to join the circus. I know that. I've experienced that. Like, what am I going to go do? You know, when I had to sit down and talk to my grandmother that I'm leaving Harvard Law School and I'm just going to go start this thing up kind of thing, and there's no money and there's no job and everything like that. She was incredibly supportive, but it felt a little bit like, you know, the trapeze artist kind of thing. That there will be a tremendous level of support for you, that there are issues that you can speak to, you can use all of your skills, and as a society, it is critical that we come together and do public problem solving together. And service is a way to get there and build legitimacy and expertise and commitment to go do that. And if I, you know, and I'm sure all of us, you know, we can help you on that journey, we want to do that.
That's a terrific segue into saying thank you to the Reynolds Program of Social Entrepreneurship for being the sponsor of this, which is one of both the jewels of NYU's Wagner School of Public Service and one of the leading places in the country where people can get support for that kind of social entrepreneurship that you all have mentioned and exemplified. And then, of course, thanks to the two of you, Michael Brown and Aaron Williams. You both not only have some of the most fun jobs around, and of which we are all envious, but you are also inspirational examples of lives devoted to public service. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you. Thank you, Gara.